I still see a number of participants coming in, but I do know that we have quite a bit of content to cover. So I do want to get started. Welcome everybody who has joined this webinar so far, and I'm sure we'll catch up with those who are going to join in a little bit. But again, welcome to the webinar co-hosted by digital scientists and Rook Quality Systems. The webinar has a mouthful of a title: Medical Device App Development, Mastering Patient Centricity and Regulatory Compliance. And we've got two experts who are going to uncover what patient centricity means, what regulatory compliance means, and how we're going to address that way up front in the development life cycle so that the teams are positioned for success down the line. I've got the easy job of covering some of the introductory slides, but we've got two established and industry experts in Maria de la Vega from Digital Scientists and Chandler Thames from Rook Quality Systems. If you go to the next slide. By way of introduction, my name is Dennis Joseph. I lead product management in the healthcare vertical for Digital Scientists. Been in the business for over 20 years across traditional medical devices, as well as software, medical devices and software solutions that are not classified as medical devices. Operated in both domestic and international markets. I think a lot of my learnings came from creating and implementing these solutions in multiple healthcare settings across the operating room, ICU, long-term care, assisted living, and as you can tell, it spans both acute and non-acute. And this was done in collaboration with a number of health systems, both in the US and internationally, and some of those are listed on the side. Most recently, I led the digital health strategy for the urology and critical care division of Becton Dickinson, which is a large medical technology company headquartered in the United States. We go to the next slide.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maria de la Vega, and I am the Director of Design at Digital Scientists. I have more than 14 years experience in UX design, service design, design management, research. I have been a part of teams both in the US and Latin America, covering projects all the way from healthcare to logistics, manufacturing, e-commerce, education, finance, a ton of different industries. So I have seen various ways in which design can be applied to deliver great user insights and great outcomes. A lot of my focus is around service design and strategy, meaning understanding really well what users need in order to deliver a product that truly satisfies their needs and solves the problems that they have. The design team at Digital Scientists is very varied. We have people from different disciplines, from accessibility to industrial design, UX design, and UX research. And we apply our skills to bring together products that will be successful in the market.
So just a quick introduction of Digital Scientists. We are a US-based technology strategy and innovation firm. We've been in the business for over 17 years, helping early to late stage medtech companies really drive cutting edge solutions and also ensuring that existing solutions are implemented correctly so that the companies can realize an ROI based on the investments that we've made. Some of the clients are listed up there. You know, we've partnered with a number of regulatory agencies as well. We really operate a couple of different ways. One is build, operate, transfer, which is, you know, we partner with our clients to build the right solution. We operate it and essentially enable the clients to take that over by transferring it back over to their teams. And in a lot of instances, we enable our clients to really hire the right talent or the capability set to effectively take that on and continue the support process. The other operating model is really being an innovation partner. And a lot of our clients reach out to us for solutions that are really cutting edge, where they don't have the capability set to move things along, and they bring our expertise in to really help with the early stage and mature the solution idea and concept before they advance it through their stage gate process. It also requires some capability sets that might not be there inside of their organization, but they have to move fast based on the business case and the urgency. And so that's where we step in and really be that innovation partner to be able to power their innovation pipeline in parallel to their teams, and a lot of times in collaboration with their teams. We are HIPAA compliant, and some of the capabilities up on the top, Maria touched on research and design. We span research, design, development, and commercialization. And the reason why that's important is because a lot of our team members have a ton of experience all the way from startup to Fortune 500. Every one of our employees have at least 12 years of experience. And what that means is we don't throw big teams at our clients. They're very small, but experienced team that move fast. And we are able to span the gamut from research all the way to commercialization so that it's a full service offering for you all who may be in different stages of your company evolution.
My name is Chandler Thames. I'm the Director of Quality at Rook Quality Systems, and I've been in medical devices for coming up on 10 years now, primarily in the quality and regulatory spaces. I've had extensive experience within QMS implementation for various different sizes of companies, producing different types of medical devices, whether it's a startup, a one-man shop, or whether it's a large Fortune 500 company, helping them establish quality management systems, design controls, risk management processes, setting up their validation processes, and also ensuring that they're maintaining regulatory compliance with their regulators, whether that be a notified body in the EU or whether that be the FDA or Health Canada. I am a BSI certified ISO 1345 internal auditor with a lot of experience in CAPAs, root cause analysis, complaint handling, and process improvement. So not just for that initial design and development, but also for that ongoing quality management system maintenance. And I've managed regulatory affairs, ISO certification process, and FDA inspections for various of Rook's quality clients, and with the primary focus on FDA, MDR, and SOR 98282, which is the Health Canada regulations. Also extensive experience in managing quality department processes, whether that's document control, record control, design controls, any sort of measurement, analysis, improvement. We can go to the next slide. So Rook Quality Systems, we are a consulting firm dedicated to helping any size company, whether they be a startup or a Fortune 500 company, develop and maintain effective and efficient quality systems. So we help set up those specialized and custom quality systems and providing consulting services for all those different classes of medical devices, whether you're a class 1, 2, or 3, with a particular focus in medical device software, as well as touching on some combination devices. So at Rook, we help with quality system design and getting that initial quality management system set up. We work with groups getting their design history file and technical files set up for eventual review by regulators. We'll also help with the audit support for those regulatory audits or internal audits. The software validation piece, whether it's a quality management system software, whether it's device software, we help with validating those, getting those design controls and risk management processes set up, as well as that regulatory submission support and quality system training, similar to this webinar today. Today's agenda, we're going to first talk about the medical device app development process, some best practices, and some customer-focused considerations. Next, we'll get into regulatory pathway identification, really identifying what you need to do to set up that regulatory roadmap, which will ultimately govern how your device is brought to market. We'll also touch on performance testing requirements, some design and development considerations, and then we'll end with a recap of the key points before jumping into a Q&A session. So with that, I believe I'll pass it to Maria.
Dennis.
Yeah, if you go to the next slide. There we go. So just to let everybody into the inception of this idea and why we thought this webinar makes sense, right? And a lot of us can speak to a number of missteps we've made. I know I can talk about mine personally, in our careers in terms of launching applications, launching solutions, and really running into a lot of risks that could have been mitigated up front if we had the discipline to identify those risks and really proactively mitigate it early on. And so when you think about medical device applications, I'm sure there are a bunch of risks that companies run into, but there are really two that really derails companies as you think about the ability to launch effectively in the market and to be able to realize the ROI that was originally intended. The first one is quality and regulatory, right? So there are a number of sort of very basic elements of quality and regulatory requirements that, if not identified upfront, really leads you to down the path of not, equipping your team in terms of resourcing, in terms of investments, not understanding the burden of that you would need to be able to justify all of the requirements for a specific classification from an FDA standpoint. So to be able to identify all of that upfront and do an early assessment is really your way of addressing that big risk early on in the development process. The next one is, let's say you are able to meet all of those requirements and you're able to launch the application. The biggest risk is around commercial, the ability to drive adoption rates, the ability to meet product market fit. As you think about outcomes, both from a clinical standpoint and from a business perspective, how do you make sure that you're driving those outcomes for the users and overall your clients? All of those are commercial risks where you've invested all of this time and effort and resources, but if you're not able to meet your commercial goals, then that leads to a substantial amount of failure. And so as we think about these two risks, which are really paramount in terms of a successful medical device launch, we believe that in order to mitigate those, it's not later in the development process, it's very early on, almost as early as when you're assessing the opportunity, and then continuing to mitigate as you go through the design planning, development B&B, and launch stage gates. And so when Maria and Chandler walk you through these, the intent here is to really start having those discussions early on within your teams, across your leadership, to be able to understand what those risks are and to put all of the checks and balances and the appropriate amount of investments, both in time and dollars, in place to be able to mitigate those risks. Now, with that, I'll transition over to Maria.
All right, thank you, Dennis. So like Dennis said, we believe that things can be addressed very early on in the process. And one way in which we do that at Digital Scientist is rooting our processes in a design thinking methodology. What that means is that we take a human-centered approach to design, meaning we focus on understanding people, their problems, their needs, and then using our creative mindset to problem solve and to create solutions that might target those needs and those pain points that they might be having in their day-to-day. So what this means in the next slide, I'll give you an example, and that is, take, for example, the patient condition journey. You have a patient that is experiencing some sort of distress, a concern, an issue. And what we do is try to understand everything that's happening to them. Things happen to them, not in a little island. There are a number of things that you need to consider in order to provide a solution that will better suit their needs. Whether that is personal relationships, people that are in the process of making decisions with them, or people that are going to be affected by whatever treatment that they're going to have, the medical team that is going to assist them, the staff, other healthcare stakeholders that are involved in their process, how they treat them, the tools that they're going to need to treat them, how they gather, consume, and make sense of all of the information that is thrown at them, how they navigate the processes of acquiring help or their treatment, and then the different platforms and services that they use while they are getting this treatment. So as you can see, there's so many things that are happening while they are going through this journey that we want to make sure that whatever we design is taking into consideration this whole context. However, when you start thinking about things in this scope, at this scale, things might get a little unruly. You give a researcher time to go into all of this different parts of the patient journey, and they might go into different rabbit holes, or you give a designer complete freedom and they will get very, very, very creative. And then when it comes down to putting together a concept that is scoped enough for development to take it over, is going to take a really long time to develop. So we have defined a very defined process that we use at Digital Scientists that is called the product blueprint. If you go to the next slide. The product blueprint, what we do is we have this established process where we want to make sure that we talk to the people that we're designing for, whether that is through one-on-one interviews or in context observations. We really want to understand what it is that they're challenged by. Then we put together a prototype. And then after we have tested the prototype, we handed it over to development. And what we do is we reduce the time frame so that we have guardrails and you have a very distinct timeline in which all of these is going to be delivered. The idea is that we work quickly, we test often, and we do it within a very scoped period of time. This guarantees that we're reducing the risk of over-designing or designing the wrong thing. So in the next slide, you will see the typical timeline of a project like this. It can go anywhere from 8 weeks to 12 weeks, depending on the scope that is defined. And this process, it has been tried and true for us. We have done it many, many times, and we are very confident in it. It requires alignment, a phase of discovery research, a phase of concept prototyping, and in parallel, talking with development to make sure that whatever design is proposing can be done. We can get very, very creative as designers, and sometimes we just dream up ideas that might not be possible. So we like talking with development so that they keep us accountable for the things that can actually be delivered at the very end. So with the product blueprint, there are a couple of phases that go with it. The next slide, we'll see that we start with what we called an alignment workshop. Then we go into discovery research, concept prototyping, and finally, validation. For the alignment workshop in the next slide, I'll give you a little brief introduction to what it is. So basically, the alignment workshop is where we align all of the stakeholders that are going to be involved in the project. It's a workshop, whether that's remote or in person. And what we do is we put together a series of activities to answer questions that we need before we start a project. We understand what the product vision is, the context in which your company or the product is going to live, a little bit about the competitive landscape, who is out there, which companies you have your eye on or products that you have your eye on, things that we need to know. Whatever you know about your current users and the things that you want to find out about them, the ecosystem in which this product is going to live. Does it need to support other users? Does it need to support other applications? And then what is the scope for this project? What are we going to do and what are we definitely not going to do? But probably one of the biggest things that we talk about during this alignment workshop is how will we measure success? How will we know that this project was successful at the very end? So in this session, the outcome is for everyone to be aligned towards the same goal. After the alignment workshop is done, we go on to discovery research. The next slide. And we have many different ways into doing discovery research to get the answers that we need about our end users. Do we do through it contextual interviews with patients, caregivers, providers, anyone who has contact with our users through their journey and that are significant in the process itself? We want to speak to them. Sometimes, if necessary, we'll do site visits and observations. In the medical device field, we would want to understand, where is this product going to be used? Does it need a lot of space? Is it something that they're going to be able to carry with them? How does it impact the daily lives of people? All of these things are important for us to know because eventually it will have a repercussion around adoption and whether or not a person is going to use it. Then we also could do landscape analysis, understanding where the industry is, where it's going, the things that are relevant for us to know. We always map the journey, trying to understand every step of the process. And then we highlight the opportunities and the recommendations that are probably going to be very important for us to tackle in the future or in the current project for us to be successful. After all of that, we go into concept prototyping. So in the next slide. Oh, so this is more of an example of what discovery research entails. So for example, this is talking about the interviews and what we want to find out in an interview, the day-to-day activities of a person, the tools they use, current pain points, how this tool might interact with other tools that they already have. But a lot of the questions that we ask during interviews come from that alignment workshop that I talked about on the previous slides. And the outcomes of this is creating a clear persona, understanding the customer journey, knowing what workflows we're going to need to tackle for the product to be successful. And then, like I mentioned, some user adoption strategies that will help us push adoption forward when the product launches. So in the next stage, we have concept prototyping. After we have defined the workflows, we start putting together the information architecture, wireframes, and the prototype, which has the closest look and feel to what the end product might be. And then with this, we are able to put it into users' hands before it's even developed. So in the next slide, we talk about concept validation. And what this is we use that prototype, we put it in front of users, and we test it out. We see if it does what it needs to do, if people understand the instructions that are there, if the workflows make sense, if it's too complicated, if there is something that is missing, if some pain points that we didn't consider in the very beginning have come up. And what we do is after those validation sessions, we will go in and continue to refine. Concept validation is a very critical point here. It is one of the points that will help you reduce risk before you invest a lot of time and resources into developing the final application that will pair with your medical device. It is important for you to assess this before handing it over to development, where it will be a lot harder to tackle any corrections that you might want to make or iterations of the product because things have already advanced in the process. So after this, the goal for us is to hand over to development deliverables that they can use and start their process super quickly with. Whether that is a design system, that means a collection of assets that they can use in the development cycle, and also a clear identification of the workflows, the technologies that they're going to have to use, and the solution architecture that is going to be key for them to start development and assessing how long it will take for them to develop the product. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chandler.
Thanks, Maria. So we'll first touch on regulatory pathway identification. This is something that's very critical because ultimately it's going to determine how your device is brought to market and whether your device can be brought to market. So in terms of US FDA, they have a process for identifying product classification where they assign product codes to devices. So when you compare it to the way that Canada and the EU does this, they have very strict product classification rules where if this applies to your product, it falls in this class. FDA does it a bit differently. They create product codes for essentially device families. which will ultimately determine the device classification. So instead of directly assigning a product classification, FDA assigns a product code, which in turn has that product classification. So FDA does have a database with all their product classifications, in which you can search through all the various devices to find a product code that's a best fit. You can search using keywords. You can search for competitor devices that are similar. Both of those pathways are options that you guys can take to ultimately discover the product code for your device. These product codes, once you've identified one, you want to verify that by comparing it to legally marketed devices under the targeted product code. So if you have one product code in mind and you look at the devices that are under that product code and they don't look like a good fit at all, you might need to consider other product codes. Now, if there's no clear product code for your device might require de novo submission. This is a process which takes a bit more time than the traditional 510K pathway, but the FDA will essentially create a new product code for your device. So for these product codes, FDA has designated 3 device classes. Class 1 are low-risk devices. Most times these don't require any sort of FDA approval or clearance. There are some exceptions to this where Class 1 devices might require a 510K, but they're a bit more rare than the ones that wouldn't require any sort of regulatory review. Class 2 are devices which require FDA clearance. These are moderate risk devices. And when we say FDA clearance, the way that the FDA clears these devices is by determining that they are substantially equivalent to an existing device on the market. So they aren't necessarily doing a full approval of the device as a standalone, but really doing a kind of streamlined comparison to a legally marketed device. Compare that to Class 3, which requires FDA approval. These are for high-risk devices, and the Class 3 device process is a bit more burdensome than the Class 2. Typically involves clinical studies or clinical trials. It involves FDA inspection of manufacturing facilities, and in general takes quite a bit more time. We can move to the next slide. So the 3 main pathways for FDA regulatory review, the simplest is the 510K pathway. So again, this is for Class 2 devices where you're able to identify that legally marketed predicate device to help establish substantial equivalence. The official timeline for this is a 90-day review time. We typically see these get processed in 4 to 9 months. The reason for the gap between that 90 days, 3 months, and the 4 to 9 month timeline is really the holds that might be placed on the submission review. So when we say holds, that's FDA essentially pausing the clock, asking questions, and you have up to 180 days to provide any sort of additional information they may request. So that 180 days seems like a lot of time, but depending on the things that the FDA is asking for, it can go very quickly. So for example, if they're requesting like retest or anything like that, you have to acquire different samples to help support that retest, or if there's any other third-party assessments that might take some time, that 180 days can fly right by. So it's very important that when you're submitting that initial submission, that everything is buttoned down and good to go. So these cost $21,760 typically. If you're a small business, which I believe the FDA defines as less than 100 million in sales, the cost is $5,440. You just have to fill out a small business designation request with FDA and provide some tax information to get that discount. The de novo pathway is for Class 1 and Class 2 devices that represent novel technology for which there's no legally marketed predicate device. So if you're unable to find a predicate device, odds are you'll have to go through the de novo pathway. A bit more time for this, 120 days or 4 months. We typically see 6 to 12 months, including those holds, just based off of FDA having to do a more extensive review as they aren't able to compare it to a legally marketed predicate device. And because of this more extensive review, the cost goes up as well. So $145,068. For that small business designation, it drops to $36,267, but this is 6 to 7 times the cost of 510K pathway. So it's definitely recommended to try to find that predicate device and move forward through that pathway. In the event that your device would be a Class 3 device, the timeline officially is 180 days, so up to 6 months, but really this can go anywhere from 9 to 36 months, including holds. The reason for that extensive timeline delay might be FDA requesting additional clinical studies, the manufacturing site inspection and audit, as well as a couple of other things as part of that more intensive review for formal approval. And because of these things, the cost also skyrockets up to $483,560. And with a small business designation, that drops to $120,890. But again, this is about 4 or 5 times more expensive than the de novo, and many factors more expensive than the 510K pathway. So unless you're absolutely a Class 3 device, it's best to try to pursue a lower device designation. And in some instances, there can be a similar device that really the ultimate determining factor between 510K, de novo, and PMA are the indications and the claims that you want to make with the device and exactly how it's used. We can go to the next slide. So when we say predicate devices, these are similar devices in terms of both indications for use and technological characteristics. Of course, no two devices are exactly the same, so there will be differences, and that's part of what FDA is going to review, is to make sure that any sort of differences between your device and the predicate device have appropriate justifications and supporting data to show that they don't impact that substantial equivalence determination. So as part of this, you want to avoid straying too far from the indications and technology of the predicate device. Otherwise, you might need to provide clinical evidence related to the use of the subject device, or you might put yourself in a new product classification and be subject to the de novo submission pathway. One of the things the FDA has come out in recent months and put more of a focus on is making sure that the predicate devices that you're identifying are recent and relevant. So FDA's continuously updating their guidances and what they expect manufacturers and developers to provide to be able to review their device. As part of that increased scrutiny that they've put on year after year, they want to make sure that the device that you're using as your predicate device is more recent, so that way they know that that device was reviewed in accordance with more recent guidances. So most of the time you want to have a single predicate device. There are some situations where having multiple predicates may be appropriate. So if you're combining device functionality from two legally marketed devices, similar technology, in those instances, you can have a second predicate, but this is something that you need to make sure is absolutely necessary because FDA really does like to see that single predicate. Another benefit of predicate device identification is the 510K summaries, PMA summaries, and de novo summaries are all publicly available information. So if you're curious as far as what sort of performance testing you would need to subject your device to, or if clinical testing is required, or if there's certain design parameters that you need to account for in your design, you can oftentimes find some of that information, even if it's a little high level within those regulatory submission summaries. So that can really be a good tool for laying out your roadmap for identifying that performance testing very early on, maybe even before you have a final prototype in hand. Just being aware of what sort of testing that you need to subject the device to can really help identify the way that you want to design the device, accounting for that testing. Next slide, please. So we'll get into some more detail on performance testing requirements and design and development considerations. So again, performance testing is something that should be considered throughout the design and development process. You don't want to completely finalize your design and your device before you start thinking about performance testing. In some instances, performance testing might be difficult to perform based off certain design considerations. So I want to make sure that's something that's at the forefront as you're starting to define some of your design requirements. So the software requirements on that note need to be readily translated into acceptance criteria for eventual testing. So FDA is going to require essentially a list of all the software requirements that your software system is going to adhere to. And those need to be unambiguous, they need to be clear, and again, readily translate into acceptance criteria for testing, making sure that it's possible to test the claim that the requirement is making. Additionally, those software requirements need to address both functional and non-functional requirements of the software system. So in addition to touching on the requirements necessary to perform the intended use, also the requirements necessary to make sure the system itself can function. Additionally, you'll need to establish a test environment, which is representative of the eventual production environment of the software. So as you're doing that testing, keeping in the back of your mind that you will have to justify to a regulatory body why that test environment was appropriate, why it's representative of what an eventual end user would be using the software as, to make sure that the test results are valid and viable. And then finally, establishing a master validation plan. And this will address the system installation configuration, verification of functional requirements, and then also the system validation in the final operating environment. So this master validation plan is basically your cheat sheet to what you're going to test, why you're testing, the level of testing that you're subjecting the different requirements to, so on and so forth. So some things to keep in mind is web-based applications should also account for qualification of any web browsers intended to be compatible with a software system. So if you're claiming compatibility with all the big web browsers, whether it's Chrome, Opera, Edge, Firefox, Safari, if you're claiming compatibility with all those systems, FDA is going to want to see that you've assessed all of those different systems, you've reviewed the release notes for the different versions of those, you've performed system level testing on each of those systems. So in some instances, different groups will scope certain operating systems that might be easier to test. or remove some things from scope. And then likewise for mobile applications, you should account for the qualification of the different mobile operating systems, primarily Android and iOS, as well as the compatible versions. So if you're, for example, claiming compatibility with iOS 14 and beyond, FDA is going to want to see that you've accounted for this in your test plan and proven that iOS 14 is compatible, as well as all of the other versions. And this is done from release notes review, making sure that the release notes for each of the operating system version updates is not going to have a negative impact on any of your testing. Identifying particular versions that you want to incorporate in your test plan. One thing that we've seen is groups testing the oldest version as well as the newest or the second newest version of the operating system in order to show that, look, we've tested boundaries and we've assessed release notes for everything in between. So therefore, we're confident that the system's validated in all those different versions. Next slide, please. So the importance of identifying test requirements really can't be understated. So if you have a full system that's been designed and you have all this testing done, that doesn't necessarily mean you're good to go, right? So that testing needs to be based off of your test requirements that should be identified earlier as part of your software requirements. So these are necessary to identify the tests that are actually required to demonstrate the ability of your device to meet those defined specifications. And in some instances, if you fail to identify these test requirements, it can lead to incomplete test cases or incomplete test reports, which can result in a failure to validate the entire software system for its intended use, failure to identify any sort of software bugs, which could lead to the need to implement software updates or implement hot fixes, which might be disruptive to the end user. You might fail to identify additional test cases and need to draft those. And you also might have to re-execute these test cases. So early on in design and development, before you're looking for that regulatory submission, these are things that can be caught. But if you fail to catch these before the regulatory submission, that's going to lead to those holes that we talked about on the previous slides for the regulatory pathways. So the better that you can have everything buttoned up before you submit to the regulatory bodies, the less likely you're going to have a business risk of a delayed device clearance or approval based off of these things that we've pointed out today. So for non-clinical performance testing requirements, again, this is something that you can get a head start by looking at the predicate devices and what sort of performance testing that they performed. But it will always include a software verification plan, which drives the testing activities that acts as essentially a catalog of your test cases, describing the test environment, and also addressing the unit integration system level testing that you'll perform in order to verify and validate your device. The testing should also define the acceptance criteria within the test protocols to make sure that the goal and the aim of the test is clearly defined before you execute. In some cases, FDA has rejected test reports based off acceptance criteria not being defined, even if the acceptance criteria, or if the test results were good, rather. Failure to identify test requirements and acceptance criteria means that you can't truly call the test a pass or a fail. So making sure that you have that acceptance criteria outlined before beginning testing is definitely critical. The non-clinical performance testing is also going to ensure all of your software requirements are validated and verified, including both functional and non-functional requirements. So that software verification plan really should tackle all of your software requirements that you've defined, whether device specific or system specific, backend, all of those things are relevant to the software requirements and testing reports. And it should also address any hardware integration functions. So even if your device is a standalone medical software as a medical device, if it's integrating or pulling data from any hardware or medical devices, even if that's not your device itself, you need to make sure that the integration is covered as well, making sure that the data is able to pass back and forth as necessary and that there's no risk being introduced from that hardware integration. Next slide, please. So for clinical performance testing requirements, this is going to vary more than performance testing requirements based off of your regulatory pathway. So for 510Ks, typically clinical performance testing isn't required. However, when we were discussing predicate devices and substantial equivalence, we touched on needing to make sure that the indications for use and the technology used is similar enough to claim substantial equivalence. Any differences in those need to be assessed to determine if you can bridge that gap with non-clinical performance testing. If that's not possible, then you would need to implement some clinical performance testing. So that while it's not necessarily required, it may be. Just because you're a 510K doesn't mean you don't have to provide clinical data, but it's just less common. And many times developers and manufacturers will scope their technology and indications for use to make sure that they can take the lightest route towards 510K clearance. So another thing to to touch on is for the clinical performance data, if there's newly identified or increased risk related to the predicate device, this might also lead to FDA requesting clinical performance data. So when you're selecting your predicate device, it's also valuable to go through the FDA databases for adverse events and recalls and make sure that your predicate device has not been subjected to any sorts of regulatory actions for recall. Medical device reports should also be reviewed to make sure that all of the risks identified in those have already been identified in your risk assessment. So if you're stuck between two predicate devices and aren't sure which one to pick, definitely check the FDA databases for recalls and adverse events, and you would want to pick the one that has hopefully none, but the least amount of those medical device events. So when clinical performance testing is required, it should target the differences between the subject device and the predicate device, particularly for the 510(k) pathway. One thing that we found is very valuable is a comparison study. We find these are effective at demonstrating that the subject device's safety and effectiveness is appropriate when compared to the predicate device. So taking a already existing, cleared, legally marketed device and subjecting it to the same protocol as your device and comparing the results and basically determining that your device is as safe, as effective, if not more, than the predicate device. Sample sizes for these studies should be based off of statistical rationale or a similar clinical study. So the FDA does have, or the US government does have, a database of all the clinical studies that are performed in the US. You can use keywords or look for competitor devices to find the clinical studies that they've been involved in and use those to pull a sample size. If one's not available, then you would want to lean on that statistical rationale. Another thing to think about is IRB approval is required for clinical studies to make sure that the study itself, being a non-legally marketed medical device and for research use at that stage, is appropriate and safe for the purpose of the clinical study. So if you're planning any clinical studies, definitely need to speak with the IRB, submit a protocol for review and approval, and that will really be the clinical study plan that identifies your protocol, your locations, your sample sizes, as well as your acceptance criteria and the goals of the study. So this process can be streamlined using the FDA's Q-Sub process to ensure that FDA agrees with your approach for the clinical performance testing. With clinical performance testing being so expensive and so timely, definitely recommend going through that Q-Sub process to make sure that FDA agrees with your approach. Otherwise, you run the risk of performing an expensive and timely clinical study, including that in your regulatory submission, and then the FDA comes back and for whatever reason doesn't agree with your study or has an issue with the end results or the data within that study, and you have to repeat any sort of clinical testing or do another study to fully bridge that gap with FDA. So going through that Q-Sub process is really a risk mitigation tool to make sure that you don't lose any more time or money as part of this process. Next slide. So for a quick recap of our key points, identifying that regulatory pathway is definitely a critical first step that will eventually define your performance testing requirements, as well as establishing the safety and efficacy of the software system. So without that regulatory pathway, it's almost like you're running in the dark. You want to make sure that you turn the lights on and understand what you're going to have to demonstrate to FDA to be able to bring that device to market. And in part of bringing the device to market for the 510(k) pathway, definitely want to make sure that the predicate devices are selected based on similar indications for use in technology. When multiple viable predicate devices are identified, the predicate device with the most extensive performance testing, as well as the least amount of medical device reports and adverse events, recalls, corrections, removals, is going to be utilized. Additionally, the non-clinical performance testing should address both functional and non-functional requirements, including unit integration and system level testing, and ensure all of your defined software requirements are verified. So what FDA is going to look for in terms of unit integration system testing is going to vary based off the risk class of your device. So for lower risk class devices that fall under the basic documentation level in accordance with FDA software guidance, for unit integration testing, you typically just have to provide plans as far as how you perform your unit integration testing, while having to perform plans, protocols, and reports with raw data for the system testing. For higher risk devices that are subject to enhanced documentation level requirements from FDA, you need to have plans, protocols, and reports for unit integration and system level testing. So depending on the risk level of your device, your burden as far as performing non-clinical, or rather providing data related to the non-clinical performance testing, shifts a little bit. But at the end of the day, everybody should be performing that unit integration system level testing. It's just a matter of what goes in front of the FDA. For clinical performance testing, it's typically not required for 510(k) submissions, except in particular instances where there might be differences or gaps in the indications for use, technological characteristics, or again, if there's been any sorts of recalls or adverse events that are of significant concern to FDA for the predicate device. In terms of test requirements for both non-clinical and clinical performance testing, definitely want to make sure that these are clearly defined based on the software requirement specifications. And if you fail to clearly define these test requirements, it can lead to the need for retest, which will cause delays in your regulatory submission process. And performance testing requirements should definitely be considered throughout the design and development process to make sure you're not designing yourself into a hole that you can't necessarily provide performance testing to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of the system. Another thing to touch on for performance testing requirements, particularly for early R&D groups, wondering what sort of our early R&D data can we utilize in that regulatory submission? And ultimately, that's going to depend on how thorough and established your quality systems are. So if you have a defined quality system, you've already touched on all of the considerations for performance testing that we touched on in the previous slides, then in those situations, you may be able to utilize those R&D validations as part of your regulatory submission. Otherwise, you might have to repeat these after you have the final device nailed down, in case the test environment, the test requirements, the acceptance criteria, qualifications of the test group, if all those things are not defined, you'll either need to justify those or run that test through a more formal quality management system defined test process. So that concludes the presentation. I think we have some time for Q&A. I see some questions coming in through the chat, so we can jump right into those. So for Chris Miller asked, how does IEC 62304 tie for software tie into IEC 62366 usability in terms of risk management? Very good question. So 62304 mandates including a ISO 14971 risk management process. That's the big standard for medical device risk management. So in having to adhere to 14971, you definitely want to make sure that you're accounting for any use case related risk. And those risks should tie into your usability study, right? So you should be outlining this usability study based off of the use-related risk assessment that you've performed for the device software. Jim asked if the costs for pathways are specifically fees to the FDA. That is correct. For the EU, notified body fees vary from the different groups that offer those services. So we would recommend getting quotes from different groups to determine what's the most viable pathway. But for FDA, there's really only one pathway, that's through the FDA themselves. So those fees are specific to the FDA. Jim also asked for a sensor that measures a parameter with a different technology than prior devices. If you can demonstrate that the sensor tech provides the same result as prior device, does that still meet 510K? A little tough to provide an exact answer on this one without actually being familiar with the sensor and the for your device, as well as the sensors in the predicate devices. Really beyond just having the same result, they're also going to look at, does the new technology introduce additional risk, whether it's functional risk, non-functional risk, use case related risk. All of those risks should be assessed to make sure that your comparison between the two different technologies is appropriate. Additionally, in addition to predicate devices, you can also incorporate reference devices within your submission. These aren't devices that you're claiming substantial equivalence to in terms of indications for use in technology, but devices that you can use to show your approach for testing or regulatory pathway for the FDA. So for example, if you have a predicate device that includes a sensor, or rather you have a subject device that includes a sensor that the predicate device doesn't have, but there's another legally marketed device that's used for a different indication for use, but incorporates that sensor, you can incorporate that as a reference device and tell the FDA, look, even though our predicate device doesn't have this technology, you have reviewed and cleared other devices which have this technology, and perform a comparison of your technology to that reference device. I think that's all the Q&A questions we had in the queue right now, so feel free to keep sending those over. Happy to walk through anything with you guys.
Yeah, we can stick around if there are any other questions that came through.
I see a question for when a product is subject to 510K exemptions, what types of documents need to be prepared? So That's a very good question. For a 510K exempt device, particularly for class ones, if you include software, you're still subject to design controls. So a lot of class one devices from FDA aren't subject to design controls. Software devices still are. I would recommend looking through the FDA guidance for pre-market submissions of software devices for FDA. That'll outline what FDA typically reviews in those software files. So while you're not going to be compiling those documents and submitting to FDA for review, you should definitely compile those to complete your DHF. So FDA is still going to want to see, when they come out for an eventual FDA inspection, your design history file, your design control records, things like that. So it's important that even if FDA is not reviewing these things, that you still have them in place, because if they're not going to review it prior to regulatory submission, odds are they will come by eventually for an on-site inspection and review those files then. Zach asks, is there any advantage of going with 510K exempt versus de novo in terms of market defense? In terms of market defense, not necessarily. So if you're 510K exempt, you have a legal pathway to commercialization without FDA review. You still have obligations in accordance with FDA requirements and regulations that you have to meet. But having a 510K exempt device that's on market versus having a de novo device that's on market, both of them are legally marketed devices. So in terms of market defense, it's not really going to make an impact. My recommendation would always be to go with the least burdensome pathway. So if your device is a good fit for a 510K exempt product classification, then I would definitely pursue that. That'll save you time, money, and then you can also use that device as a foundation for if you want to eventually expand your indications for use or technology or anything like that. You already have the foundational documents together, and you can submit a de novo or a 510K submission to kind of cover that expansion of the device. Someone asked, what's the recommendation for enforcement discretion, classification, documentation, quality approach? For enforcement discretion, if you're under a product code that's subject to FDA enforcement discretion, you definitely want to reach out to them. They often provide instructions as to how to contact them, and they'll share basically the special controls that they might have for that device. In terms of quality approach, even if you aren't fully on market, definitely recommend setting up a 21 CFR 820 compliant quality system. ISO 13485 can also help supercharge your quality system. And in doing that, you can have confidence that in having that fully established quality system, that as you're going through the requirements, the specifications, the test approach, that you're doing that in accordance with FDA requirements. So if FDA ever has to review those documents, you have peace of mind that you put them together the correct way. As far as documentation, I would recommend having the same documentation you would include in a regulatory submission on hand, excluding any sort of predicate device comparison. So still want to have all the requirements defined, still want to have all of your specifications tied together, traced between requirement specifications and your eventual test reports. So even if the burden of regulatory review is lessened based off the risk class of the device, you still have to put together essentially the same documentation with a couple of exceptions. Someone asked if each software update requires a new FDA review. So for example, if the app is distributed through a Play Store and they need to regularly update the libraries to comply with the latest OS version. So not each software update is going to require an FDA review. It's really going to depend on the nature of the software changes. So if it's a change that you can go through the FDA guidance for a letter to file as far as assessing your change for the need to submit a new 510K for an existing legally marketed device. Typically, if the change is going to introduce new use cases, change in the indications for use or user population, or has the potential to introduce any risk that you haven't previously identified, those are things that will require a new FDA review. But simple library updates oftentimes will not. That should be something that you review as part of your soup analysis. So for each release, you should be assessing all of the third-party software and software of unknown provenance, off-the-shelf software, including those libraries, making sure that the changes to those libraries don't have a negative impact on the software system itself. And if the answer is no, there is no negative impact, then you often would not be required to submit that update to FDA for review unless there's other things involved in the update which would introduce additional risk or changes to the indications for use or significant changes to the technology. keep the questions coming. These are definitely good questions.
Well, looks like the questions have dried up.
Does appear so.
All right. Well, if you all do have questions, you have the contact information on this slide, so please reach out to us. Oh, there's one more question.
Yep. So should unit testing be performed for every single software unit? The answer is yes. But to kind of add to that, in a sense, it's up to you to define, what is a software unit and how are you defining those software units. So unit testing is required for each software unit. I would recommend setting up a software architecture diagram, which clearly identifies each of the units. And you are able to, there's a little bit of wiggle room as far as what you define as a software unit, whether it's an individual file of code or whether it's a certain performance or a certain function of the device or whether it's a certain page within an app. Ultimately, it's up to you as long as they are appropriately defined, the risk class is assessed, and the relationships between those software items are defined as well. And yes, we will be providing the recording of this session.
Well, looks like we're running up at the top of the hour. So again, as I said, reach out if you all have any questions, but if not, thank you for joining and hope you've gotten some really good information coming out of this webinar. As always, open to questions even after this webinar through email. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.